All right, so welcome everybody. This is Dr. Kevin Tipper. He is a qualified doctor for roughly over 20 years now, and he is a GP partner in the same practice in Lancashire. Outside of his NHS role, he runs a private mental health coaching service, which he will tell you a little bit about himself. In this webinar, he's going to see mental illness and mental health and reflect on them and how and why current methods are not helping people to achieve long-term stable mental health. And he's going to offer his perspective on a new paradigm in psychology, which offers hope for the future. We are so excited to welcome you, Dr. Kevin Tipper. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to make you the host. From there, you can share your screen. If anyone else is waiting in on the side, it'll pop up and you could just hit admit. But from here, we should have no issues and we will make you the host.
Okay, is my screen working? Is that sharing okay?
Yeah, everything looks great.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for the introduction, Patrick, and thanks to everybody for coming to the webinar today. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope we all get something from it. My name is Dr. Kevin Tipper, and I'll introduce myself in a little bit more detail in a minute or two. But I thought it would be a good idea just at the beginning of the webinar to get a little bit of participation going between you and I. And so what I thought we'd do is a really quick quiz, but we're going to do it as a reverse quiz. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the answers, and I'd like you to tell me what question you think this is the answer to. So with regards to mental health, does anybody have any idea what question would be that would give the answer of 7.5 million? You just type your answers into the chat, and that's probably the best way of doing it. If nobody enters anything, I'll talk you through the answers, and we'll move through this bit quite quickly. Any thoughts? Okay, so yeah, how many people in the UK suffer from mental issues? Number of people with a mental health diagnosis? Yeah, good answers there. So the answer is, it is, I'm just going to let a couple of people in. The answer is the number of people in the UK that are currently taking antidepressant medication. So 7.5 million people in the UK. Question 2, the answer is 94 billion. What is the question to this one? Any offers? Money spent on mental health care. Yeah, amount of money made from pharmaceutical companies. Of mental illness, yeah. So this was slightly a couple of years old, this data now, but mental illness costs the UK around £94 billion a year, according to the OECD. So this is a huge issue for this country and around the world. Next question. Oops. Question 3 is, the answer is 4.1%. Any thoughts on what the question might be for that? So the answer to this one is, it is the amount of money that the UK total GDP is 4%. So more than 4% of the entire country's economy is spent on mental health care. And the final question, or the final answer is 23%. What is the question? Move through this quite quickly. So the answer is the total budget on NHS spend, 23% of the entire NHS budget. So it gives us a little introduction to the scale of the problem that we're dealing with here. So in terms of my background, so I qualified as a doctor in 2003, and I qualified as a GP in 2008, and ever since then I've been working as a GP partner at Library House in Chorley. So I've been there now for 13 years, and over the last couple of years I've been working privately in terms of my mental health coaching service too. So as I'm sure you'll all be aware, in the UK, GP consultations, they're usually 10 minutes long. We see between 30 and 40 patients a day, and approximately 30%, and I would probably say in the last 18 months, it's probably quite a bit higher than that, but about 30% of all GP consultations involve some degree of mental health concern with them. And as I'm sure you can imagine, or you may even have experienced, that assessing new presentations of people who are struggling with anxiety, depression, or any other mental illness in a 10-minute appointment is almost impossible, and it puts a great deal of strain on patients for being rushed for time, but also on doctors to do a proper assessment within that 10-minute time frame. And obviously, over 13 years, I've always done my best to help everybody that I work with. And part of the way that we try to help people is by using medication. And so I've prescribed every kind of medication that there is: antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs, benzodiazepines, antipsychotics, and medication to help people sleep. In addition to medication, I've also referred people to specialist mental health services where they've accessed counselling or CBT or other types of therapy that might be available, and also for consultant-led care. But after several years, I noticed quite a worrying trend. And obviously, being in the same practice over a long period of time and knowing my patients usually very well, I was seeing quite a lot of the following kind of things happening. Some people either didn't improve at all. Some people made a little improvement. Some people improved in the short term and then relapsed again further down the line. Some people improved to a level that was much better for them, but didn't quite get them to the level where they had the true potential to get to. So they might have got better 50, 60, 70%, but not 100%. And only a relatively small number of people make a complete recovery and return to thriving mental health. And so that begs the question, why is this happening? Why is it the case that we can separate conjoined twins? We can remove blood clots from people's brain by a small cut in the groin and threading a wire through to remove the clot. But yet when it comes to our psychological functioning, it seems to be a bit of a lottery as to whether people improve. And what I've come to see more recently is that in the UK, we have outstanding doctors, treatments, and we conduct research at a very high level. But all of this tends to focus on the disease and the pathology. So I've come to see that my role as a doctor is more in terms of sick care, so focusing on the disease or the illness, rather than on the health of the patient or client. And so as a doctor, we are making diagnoses and we treat the illness, the disease or the condition. And this was really interesting for me to reflect on, because at medical school and beyond, I had absolutely no lectures at all on mental health. All of the information that I learned was all around mental illness and disease and making diagnoses. And so healthcare should focus on the health of the individual rather than focusing on the disease or the illness that the person may present with. And In my view, how I see it is I see anybody who struggled with a mental illness diagnosis, I see that as pointing to where they are rather than who the person is. It's a little bit technical, but it's really important to have a little bit of an understanding around this. Is that over in the States, they have what's called the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And this is essentially an encyclopedia which is published by the American Psychiatric Association. And over here in Europe and the rest of the world, we have the World Health Organization, ICD, the International Classification of Disease, which is now ICD 11. So essentially, they are books that outline all of the diagnoses and the qualifying criteria to make those diagnoses. And the DSM in the States was first published in 1952 and had about 106 disorders in it. And then we had DSM 2, 3, and 4. And currently, they're in DSM 5, which was published in 2013. And we can see that in those 60 years or so between the first volume being published and number 5, that we've gone from 100 disorders or so up to 400 disorders and beyond in 21 different categories. So in 50 to 60 years, we've had hugely escalated the number of diagnoses that are now available to be made. This is a quote from Dr. Thomas Insel, who was a psychiatrist and leader of the National Institute of Mental Health in America up until relatively recently. And what Thomas said was, whatever we've been doing for 5 decades, it isn't working. And when I look at the numbers, the number of suicides, disabilities, the mortality data, it's abysmal and it's not getting any better. All the ways in which we've approached these illnesses, and with a lot of people working very hard, the outcomes that we've got to this point are pretty bleak. We have spent so much time diagnosing mental disorders that we actually believe that they are real, but there's no reality. They are just constructs. When I first read that, I was like, wow, that was really intriguing to me, really interesting. But what Thomas was pointing to is the fact that these diagnoses in the DSM and in the ICD-11, they're written by psychiatrists. So a group of psychiatrists will sit around a table and they will decide which symptoms constitute which disease or illnesses. And so therefore the entity, the conditions, they are made up by human beings. They are labels and constructs. And if you look at diseases like cancer or thyroid disease, you can hold a cancer in your hand or an abnormal thyroid. But with psychiatric diagnoses, you can't hold those in your hand. They're constructs and concepts and labels which are created by human beings. And as a result of that, people often feel broken or they lose hope once they are told that they have a condition. And I often hear people saying, I am depressed and I am anxious and I have a personality disorder. And so I think it's just really important to to understand where these labels actually come from. A little bit of science behind the situation for us now. I'll try and keep it really basic to avoid confusion, but everybody will have heard about the stress response, the fight or flight response, or fight, flight, or freeze, which is essentially adrenaline in our body. And the human body is designed to be in a state of stress or fight or flight for a short period of time. Now, I'm not sure if anybody has any answers to this or an understanding around it, but human beings in evolutionary terms have been designed to be in a state of stress for around about 20 to 30 minutes every 1 to 3 days. And they would typically be for situations that are genuinely life-threatening emergencies. And in evolutionary terms, that would be when we were about to be eaten by predators. The stress response is not designed to be activated on a chronic basis for 6, 10, 14 hours a day and beyond. And often it just, in terms of our normal day-to-day lives now, we seem to be spending this in, with this kind of background of stress running constantly through the system. And that's certainly not how we've been designed to, to experience stress over, hundreds of thousands of years. Again, a little bit of science, but I think it's really important to see that chronic stress activates the HPA axis. And the HPA axis is the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenal cortex. So the two areas in the brain and one that sits on the top of the kidney. And when we're under a state of chronic stress, this causes changes within our hormone levels, our biochemistry, and we notice symptoms as a result of that. And so, for example, when our body chucks out plenty of adrenaline or noradrenaline, that causes our heart rate and blood pressure to go up. Increasing cortisol is a steroid in our body, and it increases glucose as well. And this prepares us for the fight or flight. It prepares us to need to be able to run away and get away from a genuinely life-threatening emergency. But adrenaline, cortisol, and glucose cause inflammation within the body. And so when the body is exposed to chronic stress on a long-term basis, the inflammatory changes that happen in the body often cause physical health symptoms as well. Now, when we're in a situation where we're about to be eaten, obviously there are certain functions of our body that are not helpful, that we don't need, energy to be pumped into. And in those situations, the body's not interested in growth and maintenance. The immune system's not really relevant. Sexual reproduction is obviously not relevant when we're in a life-threatening situation, and our digestion processes are not relevant. And so those factors are down-regulated. So understanding which things are upregulated and which things are downregulated can help us to understand the knock-on consequences of chronically activating this HPA axis. So this biochemical dysregulation that comes about from chronic stress activating the HPA axis then results in a drop in our serotonin levels. And antidepressants are SSRIs, which increase serotonin levels. And so logically, it makes sense. If the serotonin is down, we give people an antidepressant, which increases serotonin and helps us feel better. But how I encourage people to think about this is that if you imagine that you've got a leak coming from the ceiling, if you put a bucket underneath that leak, the bucket is helpful. But the bucket is not going to be able to stop the leak at the source of where that leak is coming from. And so it's fundamental to understand cause and effect. So the cause is the leaky pipe in the floor above, and the effect is the water as it drips through onto the floor. And so putting a bucket under a leak is like giving an antidepressant to somebody who's depressed, is that it treats the effect, which is the symptoms of depression, but the cause of the depression in terms of the chronic stress isn't being addressed, which is like leaving the pipe to continue to leak. And so some medical conditions that we often experience as a result of chronic stress include high blood pressure, abnormal heart rhythms, diabetes, osteoarthritis due to chronic inflammation, a variety of autoimmune diseases, plus more obvious things like obesity, substance misuse, alcohol problems as well. But if we think about it, the body is beautifully engineered to keep itself in balance all the time. So when you cut yourself, it heals. When you walk into a bright room, your pupil constricts. And equally, if you've got gastroenteritis, you've got diarrhea and vomiting, then you might feel awful at the time, but that is the body's way of removing the toxins. So even though you feel awful, it's actually serving you. It's beneficial. It's helping you to get yourself back into balance. And so the way I see anxiety and depression as a coping mechanism is that this is our body's response due to overstimulation of the fight or flight response. And in that way, it's very much like a fuse that blows. And if at home your fuse blows, and it may be inconvenient while you have to go and sort it out, but if the fuse didn't blow, the consequences of that would be much, much more significant and severe. And so anxiety and depression often it's telling us something, it's telling us that there is a problem, but we're not tuned in closely enough to understanding what the problem is. And so we see anxiety and depression symptoms as a real problem without understanding what information they're actually trying to tell us. And I'll develop this a little bit more as we go through. Well, where does chronic stress come from? So essentially, there are three places that that stress can come from. It can come from being now, if you find yourself in a situation that is genuinely threatening, stressful, that kind of thing. Most of the time, though, it comes from the past in terms of guilt, self-judgment, resentment, hurt, or perhaps grief or loss, and also worrying about the future. So going into the what if and over analysis. So most often, people would spend time either worrying about the past or thinking into the future. And from what I've seen, there are two essential questions. Um, and in order to achieve good mental health, I think understanding the answer to these two questions really is fundamental. The first question is, where does our experience come from? So why do we feel what we feel? Question two is, who are we really? And therefore, who are we really not? So by understanding where our experience comes from and who we really are, this really helps us to understand mental health much more clearly. And the further our understanding is away from the correct answers to those two questions, the more the gap is wider for us to fall into innocently into the trap of stress, anxiety, and depression. Now, I see and talk to people every single day, many times each day with stress, anxiety, and depression. And I would say that there's probably around about 10 things that people often would say to me that would, that they say are causing them to be stressed, anxious, or depressed. And typically, those things would be my family or my children, my work, my boss, my job. I haven't got enough money, chronic illnesses, bereavement and loss, moving house, unemployment, my partner causing me problems. There's a few more, but there's a general theme that usually, around those kind of aspects. And so what that essentially is saying is that people are experiencing what they're experiencing. They're feeling what they're feeling because of things that are happening to them from the outside. But all of these things that are happening around me are causing me to feel what I feel. And so the direction of their experience is coming from the outside into them, into themselves. But my assertion to you is that that actually isn't the way it really works. So where do my feelings actually come from? So what we're saying is that it's not our work, our boss, our job, our money, our partner that is causing our feelings, although it really does look like it is at times. But where our feelings actually come from, it is only from one place. Our feelings can only come from our thinking in the moment. And as a result of our thoughts, that generates us to feel what we feel. And then based on what we feel, it then drives us to undertake a certain type of behavior based on how we feel. And I like to think of it as thought and feeling as being very much like a coin with heads on one side and tails on the other, except it's thought on one side and feeling on the other. And so what this is pointing to is that we live in the feeling of our thinking, but not in the feeling of our external circumstances. And, and so it's not our work, our family, our money, our partner. It really looks like it, but it is our thinking about our work, our family, our money, and our partner, which actually makes a really big difference. The more we understand where our experience is coming from through thought, the less frightened we can be about that experience itself. And if you think about this, if external factors really have the power to make us feel something, then, for example, if two people went to the cinema and you watched the same film, then if the film was making you feel what you feel, then both people would have exactly the same feelings around the film. But when you come out of the cinema, as one person might say they thought it was an excellent film, one person might say they thought it was an awful film. And so the film hasn't created our experience, it's our thinking about the film that had created our experience. Let's talk a little bit about the nature of thought. And a really helpful metaphor that I use with my clients and patients is to describe thought a bit like a bubble machine. And when the bubble machine is switched on, it just continues to throw out bubble after bubble after bubble, time and time and time again. So thoughts are like bubbles, they're constantly being produced. Some bubbles are big, some bubbles are small. Some of them will pop immediately, some of them will travel right across the room. So thoughts are like bubbles, but the key thing to understand about the nature of thought is that all thought is transient, just like a bubble. It will pop at some point. Some of them might last longer than others, but they all pop in the end. And the other thing that is interesting to look into is that no thought is inherently positive or negative. So a thought is just a thought, and we can then, by the way that we distort that thought through how we associate with that thought, we can then make it positive or negative. It's kind of like saying, I'm only interested in the big bubbles that pop only when they touch the wall, and all of the other bubbles are really, really bad bubbles. Well, you can set artificial criteria like that, but you're the one who's actually setting the criteria to judge the bubbles against by doing that. And for me, I see that no human being can ever really control their thoughts. And this, for me, a lot of psychological therapies try to get people to change their thinking. They try to take a negative thought and turn it or reframe it into a positive thought. But human beings, we can't control what thoughts come into our head. We never know what we're going to be thinking about from one minute to the next. But we can control how much energy we give to a thought once it comes into our conscious awareness. And the more energy we give to the thought, the bigger it gets, the more real it looks, and the more we believe that it's true. So it's kind of like blowing into a balloon. It doesn't take up any space without air, and the more energy you blow into it, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And because thought is transient, because all thought, I mean, have you ever had a thought that has never gone away? Yes, it might come back and it might come back regularly, but that thought always disappears at some stage. And when that thought changes, the feeling will change with it. And so the second aspect is, who are we? If somebody walked up to you in the street and said to you, who are you? How would you answer that question? I would say that a lot of people would say, that I am their name. So I am Kevin, I am a doctor, I am a dad, I am a son, um, etc. Or they might say, well, I am me. This is me. This meat suit, this body is who I am. And I think that's a really interesting thing to reflect on as well, because if you were involved in an accident and you ended up losing both of your arms and both of your legs, your body has changed significantly. But are you still you? And my assertion is that you would still be who you are, even if your body changed. So, I don't think it's correct to say that who we are is just our body. Some people would say that who they are the thoughts that they are experiencing. I have these thoughts in my head, and what those thoughts say are me. And other people would say I'm the kind of person who, and then they, their beliefs. I am a shy person, I am an extrovert, and so on. But my assertion is that those things really are, they're labels. Again, my name is a label. My job title as a doctor, because I did a course at a university and got a certificate for it. But that's not really who I am. So on that basis, then, who really are we? And my suggestion is that who we really are is before our thinking, and is more than any self-concept that we can ever have. And who we really are as human beings is the thinker. We are the person who is having the thoughts. And so we are the observer of our thinking, and we are not the content of our thinking. We are the person who is having the thoughts. Without your story, you don't disappear, you emerge. So often when when we're born, we have no real awareness. We don't have any concepts of ourselves. And as we grow up through our childhood, we have these life events and things our parents say to us and things teachers and society in general, and we develop these concepts of who we think we are. But who we think we are is not who we really are, because who we are the space, the awareness where our thinking comes from, where the consciousness that thought emerges from. So if we believe that who we really are is the content of our thoughts, then as our thoughts change and they go up and down in terms of better quality thoughts, worse quality thoughts, then our experience of our feelings is going to be up and down. And as thought changes, our feelings change with it. But in that respect, we end up on the roller coaster of life. We're at the mercy of our thinking, and our well-being is dependent on the thoughts that we have then in that situation. But if we can't control our thoughts, then to me, it doesn't look like a good idea to outsource our well-being onto something that we can't control. So what is mental health? My take on this is that mental health is not about not having certain thoughts, controlling thoughts, or not feeling low, down, negative about things. Mental health is the continual movement back towards mental well-being. And understanding where my experience is coming from and who I really am, I think is fundamental. So when I have a really low mood, I know that that low mood is coming about because I'm having low quality thinking in the moment. And human beings will commonly say, well, I feel really low. What's going on around me that's making me feel this? So they misattribute where those feelings are coming from to external circumstances. Whereas, as I've just discussed, our, our feelings can only come from our thought taking form in the moment and not from those external factors. And so understanding that my experience is coming from thought in the moment is really, really fundamental to achieving mental health, and also understanding who we really are rather than who we think we are. The mental health is our innate resilience, which is there before and underneath our thinking. It's there when we're born. Um, when we see the kindness of the design, that our symptoms are always helpful, it's just that nobody ever told us how they are helpful. And so symptoms of stress, of anxiety, of depression it's like the body is waving a flag. It's saying to us right now, in this moment, you're using your thinking in a really harmful way against yourself. It's there to help us. The mental health is peace of mind. We're all born with it. It's our starting point. And innocently, we move ourselves away from it by engaging in unhelpful thinking. And there's another metaphor that I really like, the diamond metaphor, um, which is that the diamond is like the core of wellness and well-being that we all have inside of us. And over time, we put all these layers and layers and layers around the diamond that cover the diamond over, kind of like layering it with layers of horse manure. And and these stories and these beliefs that we make up about ourselves and tell ourselves that we're true take us further away from the diamond. But of course, we don't like other people seeing the horse manure on the outside. So we put a layer of nail varnish on the outside to make everybody think, that everything is great. But the thing that's important to realize about that is that the diamond is always there. It's there inside of us 100% of the time. It's just that innocently we're layering it over with unhelpful thinking. And this formula, I think, is the simplest way of looking at it, which is clarity equals capacity minus contamination. So the clarity of our thinking is equal to our capacity for clear thought, which is always 100%, minus the degree of contamination. And so the more contamination we have, the less clarity we have. This quote, I think, is really powerful from Sydney Banks, which is that everybody, every human being is sitting in the middle of mental health. They just don't know it. And so, in summary, um, everybody does their best with the level of understanding that they have. But when that level of understanding changes, then everything else changes with it. Medication is very rarely the solution, and often strategies and techniques to try and change thought are not very helpful because we can't choose our thoughts, and therefore it's futile to try to control something that we physically can't control. Our feelings only come from one place. Our feelings come from thought in the moment. They don't come from external factors. And that's how the human experience really works. So in conclusion, the way I see it is that there's one cause of mental illness, and that is chronic mental stress. And all of the diagnoses that are in the DSM and the ICD-11, all of those ways, all of those different diagnoses are ways that human beings come up with to try to resolve that, the feeling of insecurity and the feeling of discomfort within themselves. But there is wisdom in those symptoms, but nobody's pointed to us in that way before. The chronic mental stress can cause psychological and physical symptoms. Understanding where your experience comes from and who you really are the two big questions that help you to take back control over your feelings rather than being controlled by them. We live in the feeling of our thinking 100% of the time. And it's kind of like a fish in water. A fish doesn't know that it's in water because it's surrounded by water, and human beings are the same. We don't realize that we are surrounded by thought because we have on average between 60 and 100,000 thoughts every single day. And so we're really not very good at noticing our thoughts, but we're really very good at noticing our feelings. We're much more sensitive to our feelings than we are to our thinking. In terms of my mental health coaching, I help individuals on a one-to-one basis who struggle with stress, anxiety, depression, or any other mental health conditions. I work alongside businesses to reduce long-term employee absenteeism, and I currently offer online coaching packages via Zoom. And these are my contact details. If anybody's interested in having a conversation with me, drkevintipper.co.uk. I'm on Facebook and LinkedIn. I also, if anybody's interested, I have a depression webinar, which is at www.unlockingmentalhealth.com, which is absolutely free. And you might find some benefit from watching that if you know people that struggle with depression. And my telephone number 07872 162692. That's the end of my presentation, and I'd be very happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kevin. We are so excited to have had you today. This was brilliant. I've taken away so much. I've been writing about a bunch of stuff. So thank you very much for everyone for attending. Would you mind just stopping the recording, Dr. Tipper?